Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Tuesday topic. Today's topic is Ethically Speaking, Creating Safe Research Environments. And our speaker today is Dr. Leslie Ashburnardo, who is the Vice Provost for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at Drexel University. All right, and so without further ado, let me just throw it over to you, Leslie.
Yes.
Take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, Darren. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining me here today. Hope folks online can hear everything okay. Sounds good. All right. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and discuss safe research environments with you all. I want this to be a conversation. So we do have some participation requirements going on throughout the presentation, but also just feel free to stop and ask questions. For folks who are online, may not be able to see your hand, so Darren is going to help monitor the chat. So of course, feel free to ask questions anytime as well. I wanted to get us started with just a quick write exercise. So if you would take a couple of minutes to just think about this question: what would make a research environment safe versus unsafe for you? I am actually going to give us a couple of minutes here on my phone. And for now, this is just your own thoughts.
Leslie, we just had somebody join us if you want to just give her the prompt.
Oh, okay. Yes, at this point, we're doing just a short, quick write. Our time is almost up for that, but if you could think about what would make a research environment safe or unsafe for you. And that's something that we'll come back to here in just a few minutes. But that was our 2 minutes. I'm going to try to keep us on task here because I'm usually really bad about staying to time. So just an overview, some objectives that I have for this workshop. Obviously, we're going to talk about what safe research environments are. I'll give you an opportunity for folks who'd like to share your thoughts about that. What kinds of interpersonal behaviors can make a research environment feel unsafe? How the culture of science and research can contribute to that lack of safety. And I try to end, a lot of the work that I do is pretty emotionally heavy. So I try to end on a lighter note. What can you do to help change the culture? What can we all do to help change the culture? All right. Before we jump in, I always like to start with just some community agreements, especially because some of the topics that I tend to cover in various workshops that I give can be triggering sometimes. And so what I like to, in a nutshell, I propose the following. So trust and deliver. Trust that each of us is coming to this with no malicious intent, and that each of us is an expert in our own experiences. Deliver honesty, truth, and engagement. I think that we always learn more when we are engaged and willing to share. Deliver grace, understanding, and humility. And then finally, and for folks who are here in the room, you might not be able to see the bottom there, but the modified Vegas rule, I like to think of as, what is said stays here, but what is learned gets shared, right? So we shouldn't say like, oh, I was in this thing and Roseanne said blah, 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 blah. But the lesson from what Roseanne shared with us in confidence here today can be taken out. Any others that we should add to this? Sound good? Okay. I'm just going to add one more, and that is again for time. So if I notice that we are running short on time because these 50 minutes, 55 minutes, whatever we have together fly by, if I notice that we are running desperately behind, I will try to move us along, but certainly feel free, and I'll provide my contact information. In fact, I shared the copy of these slides with Darren to share out with all of you. Has my contact information. Happy to get together again with you sometime in the future. All right, so coming back to that initial reflection, Is anyone willing to share what would make a research environment feel safe or unsafe for you?
Speak up a bit. I think it kind of depends on the environment, but I know we do a lot of work with researchers in laboratory settings. So making sure that, the lab is up to code and everything is, registered and calibrated correctly is probably an important piece of safety for that environment.
Absolutely. So especially in lab settings where, measurement must be precise, where machinery can go awry and needing to follow safety protocols for sure. Absolutely.
There are a couple in the chat.
Yes.
One is not being guaranteed privacy, no IRB protocol approved, interviews not taking place in a private space, being able to make mistakes and having all the information necessary to complete tasks.
Yeah. So I'm hearing like psychological safety is really important in this too, right? So certainly IRB is in place to help protect that so that people understand their rights. And I think the privacy, confidentiality, anonymity when we can is really important in IRB. But really creating an environment where it's okay for us to make a mistake, right? We're here to learn. First and foremost. And so, we're all on a journey, whatever the subject matter is. And so being willing or being able to make a mistake and not feel like we're going to be negatively judged for that.
And I also think, power dynamics are really challenging.
Yeah.
I think faculty or students could feel very vulnerable.
Absolutely.
Because of the power struggle. And I've had personal issues with that, especially when you're at that, year where you're going up for tenure. And so it could be really challenging.
Yeah. Yeah. So power dynamics, whether it's, faculty and students or ranks among faculty, right? And particularly when we're up for evaluation, those concerns are all the more salient. Yeah. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about both physical and psychological safety. Thank you so much for sharing those ideas there. Totally in line with where I'm headed with this. So on the left is a poster that I think captures that notion of physical safety. And certainly for a very long time, when we talked about research environment safety, that's all we were really thinking about, right? Is following safety protocols, making sure that everything was clean in our environment, sanitized in our environment, that kind of stuff. But thankfully, we have also more recently begun to be much more intentional and thoughtful about that psychological safety piece, right? And not just the legality, although that's certainly a piece of it, that we are bound by our EEO, Title VI, Title VII, Title IX, that there are federal regulations that protect us against various forms of biases, and we have mandates to follow those, of course, but also just norms, right? Creating norms of respect, norms of collaboration. Anymore, I think, having been in a social science field, my background is social psychology, I feel like even within that field, over the course of the time that I've been part of that, over the last 3 decades or so, that really dates me, that I've seen norms like that change, right? That it went from a place where being first author or even solo author was everything to team science being everything, right? And so we started paying attention to our own research findings that the more diversity and collaboration we could have amongst our teams, the more innovative our science would be. So we're going with that broad definition, and again, being a social psychologist, being a vice provost for DEI, I'm sure you're not surprised that I'm going to focus more on the psychological safety component of this. So one of the scientists who really helped move that focus across different scientific disciplines, from more of a physical safety to a broader definition that includes psychological safety, is Dr. Jane Willenbring, who is a geologist. And so I just want to share with you a short clip of her story. As has been brought to light, thanks to Jane and others, we have learned that science that's conducted in field settings, particularly as remote as Antarctica, like she did her dissertation work in and does a lot of her research in currently, are subject to a lot of both physical violence and harassment, right? So the physical and the psychological safety threatened in those remote locations. So I'm just going to play this short clip for you to share her story. Maybe.
Jane Willenbring is a geologist who solves problems related to the Earth's surface. In 2020, she was featured in a NOVA documentary called Picture a Scientist, found on PBS Passport. She and 2 other women shared their experiences in the sciences, ranging from brutal harassment to years of subtle slights. Tonight, Willenbring gives her brief but spectacular take on making science more diverse, equitable, and open to all.
I'm a geologist and I study how landscapes change. When I was starting to do my master's degree, one of the things that I was so excited that I was going to get to do is to actually go to Antarctica. And then when we finally got there, the thing that was most challenging to me was the behavior of my graduate advisor. Every day there would be some comment about who I had had sex with. He would call me a slut and a whore. It was just very difficult to keep my spirits up during that period. And so I remember it was, just very difficult to navigate that situation. He told me that if I said anything about it, that I would never have a job in science. That was really hard. I was pretty vulnerable at the time because I really needed to get this degree and I needed to get a letter from him so that I could go on to get my PhD. And so I just kind of had to suck it up. And that's basically what I did for over a decade. I did not realize how many women who are doing field science experience this kind of behavior. Over half of them experience sexual harassment doing field work. One day, my little girl said, "I want to be a scientist just like you." And she was 3 years old, and that little comment from my little girl just triggered me. That night, I decided to file a Title IX complaint against my former advisor. Other women came forward as a result. He filed an appeal. Then the president of the university actually stepped in and said, "Nope, we are firing him. He is no longer going to be working at this university." He had a glacier named after him in Antarctica, and they actually decided to rename the glacier. I actually don't know what he's doing now. When you talk to people about how to improve academia or STEM for women, you hear a lot about we have to get more women interested in science and math. I feel like we should take a step back and stop asking how we can, get more women interested and sort of protect the women and people of color and people with disabilities and LGBTQ persons who are in science already. Have done a lot of work since submitting the harassment complaint to try to make it so that my daughter has a better science life than I did. My name is Jane Willenbring, and this is my brief but spectacular take on calling out harassment in the sciences.
Jane Willenbring, thank you.
All right. Well, I could see the folks in the room, the shock, right? It is shocking to hear her story, but I hope that you were equally shocked by the percentage that she gave in that clip, that in field research, our best estimate, which is probably not even a very accurate estimate because sexual harassment, for all the reasons that we talked about, power, and you heard her refer to her fears about reporting her advisor, and certainly there's that conflict of interest, really, right? That this person is helping promote your career and maybe won't if you report them for this kind of behavior. If anything, it's probably an underestimate. 50% was what she said in that particular field.
Thank you for your courage, for sharing it with all of us. And you can watch all of our brief but spectacular episodes at pbs.org.
Let me close out of this, Darren, just to go back to
I
the.
think you hit escape,
Okay, gotcha.
and then you can just advance to the next slide. And just start the screen share. Yep.
Okay. I think, sorry for the technical glitch there. I think that when we watch videos like this, it's really easy for us to think, oh my gosh, that one guy was just horrible. And I'm not saying that he was not horrible. Obviously, his behavior was very horrible. But again, to think about how if it were really just the problem of a few bad apples, we couldn't have statistics like she reported. And when we look across disciplines, it's not like field research is the only place where bad behavior is happening. So according to this one report, so this is coming out of actually a bipartisan effort, amazingly enough, right? Combating Sexual Harassment in Science Act. If we could get a bipartisan effort to move this through, what an amazing feat that would be. But this was a quote from 2021. Only 23% of women who earn STEM degrees stay in STEM careers. And sadly, a culture of harassment is one of the largest factors in our inability to retain women in the scientific workforce. That's really compelling to me. And certainly when we add all the other intersecting identities to that, it's probably the statistics are even higher, right? What about these cultures? So I'm going to share with you some literature from my discipline, social psychology. This is one of those cringeworthy moments where I think, oh my gosh, I wish that as a field we had named this something else, because almost automatically, like, men are like, whoa, wait a second, I would never do this, right? The researchers, Jen Berdahl and Peter Klick, who coined masculinity contest cultures, I can assure you, knowing both of them, neither of them wanted to throw men under the bus. But they were interested in examining what some people call like toxic masculinity, right? And so what they scientifically investigated was this idea of masculinity contest cultures, or MCCs. And they argue that this can happen in various organizations or fields, right? And there are 4 different characteristics of an MCC. So showing no weakness, right? You can't admit. You can't make a mistake, like we talked about. You can't admit that you have doubts or that you have worries, or a lack of confidence in yourself. I certainly felt that way in academia generally, perhaps especially in being in a science field. Strength and stamina, powering through adversity, working long hours. It's crazy to admit this, but in my previous institution, I decided not to take medical leave when I had a very serious illness. And I think that sort of mentality contributed to it, right? Like, oh, I've got this, I can do it. And I could do it with the help of, thankfully, a lot of really caring colleagues, supportive colleagues who could help me make some adjustments. But when you stop and think about that, that's not a smart thing to do. And yet it characterizes a lot of our environments. Putting work first, not letting anything outside of work interfering with that. How many times have you had regrets about missing something because you prioritized work that you had to do? I know that I feel that way often. And then the dog eat dog kind of idea, where it's not about just doing your very best, but it's about like destroying all of the competition, right? And so this idea of, you can see the publication date, we started talking about masculinity contest cultures in 2018. And since then, researchers have done a lot more to kind of investigate what sorts of fields tend to be MCCs, what the implications of MCCs are, et cetera. And so, Andrea Vial and her colleagues found that people's ideas about MCCs were strongest. People perceive their disciplines to be masculine contest cultures in these fields. I have them in the order in which they appeared in that study. So these were all the ones that were kind of above the mean in a survey of people's perceptions of different fields. Certainly, any setting can have elements of this, but these were the ones, and you can see the sciences make up a big chunk of what people feel like are masculinity contest cultures. And again, I want to underscore that this is not about having more men in a particular field. It is about the culture of that field. And in fact, women often contribute to that culture as well. Right, there is a phenomenon called queen bee, whereby the more women have had to struggle and fight to get to the top of their field within one of these masculine contest cultures. And when they reach that pinnacle, you would hope that they would maybe pull other women up, but often queen bee syndrome kind of occurs, and instead they shut other women out and raise the bar even more. Like, well, I had to do all of this to get to where I am, so should you. And so, you might think about various contexts that you've been in, whether it's been men and or women who have contributed to that masculinity contest culture. In addition, MCCs are bad for everyone. This particular study by Tammy Allen and her colleagues only focuses on men and women. Unfortunately, it does not include gender non-binary data. But as you can see, the pattern is very clear. This is the relationship between the extent to which people perceive their work environment to be a masculinity contest culture and how much burnout or emotional exhaustion. Emotional exhaustion is one component of burnout they reported feeling. And you can see on the left, the panel is that relationship among women in the study. On the right, it's the relationship among men in the study. And you can see that for both men and women, the more people perceive their field to be a masculinity contest culture, the more emotionally exhausted they reported feeling. And interestingly, there was actually an interaction here. So if you look within that right panel where we have data for men, the people who exhibited the strongest relationship between MCC and emotional exhaustion were men who were low in trait competitiveness. So if you think about that, if you are a man who does not really like competition, and this is why I, again, think that it's a culture thing, a setting thing, and not something that's innate to people. But if you're just a person who generally doesn't really like competition, and you are a man and you are in one of these environments, you are violating a gender norm, a gender expectation, right? Because we socialize men to be competitive. And so if that is not something that fits you, then being in that kind of environment is particularly exhausting for you, right? So bad for everybody. I'll take a breath here. So far, we have talked about some fairly extreme forms of bias, like sexual harassment. But I wanted to share a clip next that kind of illustrates that that's really only the tip of the iceberg, right? That there's a wide range of biases that can contribute to a lack of psychological safety. I just wanted to see if there are any questions so far. Okay, so this next video clip, super short, it also references the movie, the documentary Picture a Scientist. If you have not seen that, I highly, highly recommend it. I think you can find it now on Netflix. I can't say enough about that particular documentary. It has researchers who are doing the work in this. I was excited to, recognize like all of the names of the people that I saw in this, and it's just a really, really powerful set of stories. So this is just a very short clip from that.
I'd like to welcome all of you to this convocation on the most important topic. Together, we can do better, certainly addressing sexual harassment.
The best estimates are about 50% of women faculty and staff experience sexual harassment, and those numbers have not really shifted over time. If you think about science, right now we have a system that is built on dependence, really singular dependence of trainees, whether they are medical students, whether they are undergraduates, or if they're graduate students, on faculty for their funding, for their futures. And that really sets up a dynamic that is highly problematic. It really creates an environment in which harassment can occur.
Generally speaking, sexual forms of sexual harassment, like come-ons, unwanted sexual advances, those are actually the rarest forms of sexual harassment. They actually don't happen very much. Mostly you see put-downs.
We use the metaphor of an iceberg to really get across the various forms of sexual harassment. What's gotten most of the attention is unwanted sexual attention, coercion. Those are in the public eye, and I think everyone would agree we absolutely need to address those.
And then you have all the stuff that's underneath. Those are actually more than 90% of the sexual harassment. The subtle exclusions, being left off an email, not being invited to a collaboration where you're the clear expert, just these little moments that make a woman feel like she doesn't belong. That's a really common experience.
We found that consistent gender harassment actually has the same impact as a single episode of unwanted sexual attention or coercion. So it is not something to be ignored.
Okay. I just want to underscore what she just said there, right? So there's literature to back her up on this, that a single episode, the repeated experience of these more subtle forms of bias kind of add up and have the same negative health consequences, psychological consequences on people as a single episode of something that's more overt. The kind of thing that we were like, wow, that was calling someone a slut in your lab. That's really terrible. But when you think about just what people experience in terms of those more microaggressions, feelings of being left out, not being part of the club, being out of the loop, not having the appropriate information that you need to do your job. Equipment sabotage was one of the things that was listed on there. So being on the receiving end of things like that, you can imagine if that is your consistent experience, coming to work and experiencing that on a near daily basis, and it's really hard to develop laws about that, like don't be a jerk, right? We're going to arrest you if you're a jerk. It's really hard to legislate that behavior. And so it goes unreported. People don't take it as seriously when it is reported. And that is where the emotional toil comes from, right? The toll that it has on our psychological well-being. So a lot of pretty heavy information, but I, again, wanted to spend the last half of our time together talking about what we can do to change that culture. So I think very critically, and why I opened the presentation the way that I did, is that I think it's super important for us all to learn to recognize bias in all of its forms, right? When something is really overt, like sexual harassment, it's very clear. We can all point to that and be like, that is wrong. And we have laws about that. But by definition, microaggressions and other acts of incivility have ambiguous intent, right? People say things and not even really necessarily recognize that those are mean things to say, hurtful things to say. And so when we're focusing on whether or not someone has experienced bias, I encourage you not to focus on the intent behind that. Take that out of the equation as you're looking at that behavior, and focus on whether harm was done to a person or to a group. Okay? As you become better at recognizing bias in all of its forms, I also encourage you to confront it, right? When do you feel safe doing so? So for example, among peers, confronting inappropriate behavior. Think about your role in shaping the norms in your work environment, right? That we can, through our behavior, through what we condone or not condone, we can change how other people are behaving around us. And so this is another one of those words that I wish the literature had gone a different way with, because when I say confrontation, people think like, oh my God, I don't want to be confrontational with anyone. But confrontation, as we define it in social psychology, could be verbal. It could be that kind of confrontational, heated, use swears, whatever, kind of calling someone out. But it can also be calling someone in, getting people to just kind of reflect, asking a question to get someone to reflect on what they just said and the impact of what they just said. It could be a nonverbal, right? It could just be turning away, like being like, that's communicating something to the people who are around us. And the purpose of confrontation, of course, is to communicate in whatever form our dissatisfaction with prejudicial and discriminatory treatment directly to the perpetrator who is responsible for that remark or for that behavior. I can share with you in this literature, even though we don't like the name confrontation necessarily, studies that have examined, including experiments that have examined the impact of being confronted, have shown that it reduces perpetrators' subsequent reliance on stereotypes and their subsequent reports of prejudicial attitudes on like standard measures of prejudice, various kinds of biases, racism, sexism, etc. It helps establish a norm regarding the unacceptability of interpersonal mistreatment. Right? It really does communicate. This is not the kind of workplace that we will permit that kind of behavior. Right? So, and that is powerful. When you think about the role of norms in your everyday work behavior, there are a lot of things that are not formally codified here at Drexel, but I guarantee everyone around, in CNHP, everyone who works in the health sciences building kind of picks up on like, when's an acceptable time for me to show up? Even if you don't have to punch a clock. When's an acceptable time for me to leave? How long can I sit on that email, right? We're picking up on what other people are communicating to us through their behavior and the norms that they set. I'm going to miss a couple of these. Darren, could you slide the out of the way?
If you grab the mouse, you can grab that bar and drag it where you need it to.
Okay. I'm going to stick that up here so that you won't miss that. We talk a lot about allyship, and that word gets thrown around pretty loosely anymore. But in my research career, one of the things that I was very interested in investigating is what is true allyship, as defined by people who have marginalized identities, like how do they see that? And there is a literature on this now, and confronting prejudice, confronting bias is one of the hallmarks of true allyship. So people are looking not at folks who go around saying like, oh, I'm an ally, but they're really looking for, do you walk the walk instead of just talking the talk? Obviously, there are going to be situations where maybe you're not among peers, maybe you don't feel psychologically safe to confront that behavior. I know, in fact, I have done research on power dynamics and how that can hinder confrontation. But thankfully, we have mechanisms for reporting here at Drexel. So one thing that you can do if you don't feel comfortable reporting yourself is you can talk to an authority figure, right? Someone that you trust, a supervisor, if you trust that person, someone who is a formal advisor within your unit, someone who's just a trusted colleague. And I think it's important for all of us to recognize that all of us as faculty and staff here at Drexel are mandated reporters. Meaning that when someone comes to you, if someone were to come to you and say, this happened to me in class, I feel like I was, the victim of sexism in class. I felt sexually harassed by my advisor. Can I talk to you about that? Of course, listen to that person, but remind them that you are also a mandated reporter, and your obligation then is to visit EIC's website and file a report. Now that can be done anonymously, or you can simply, reach out, pick up the phone and call them and talk to them. A zillion different ways to get there. There's a nice flow chart on their website. And again, I'm providing you with a copy of these slides so that you have this resource with you. But I think that sometimes people forget that we're all responsible for helping to report bias and harassment that happens here in our environments, because obviously not everyone can be everywhere at one time, right? Like the people who are investigators in EIC cannot be omnipresent, right? So they rely on us to make those reports. Again, those reports can be made anonymously if you feel at risk for whatever reason. And so, again, I encourage you to check out the resources that are available with EIC, which is our Office for, I always forget to say the acronym, the Office for Institutional Equity and Inclusive Culture. They're the DEI unit on campus that is responsible for our EEO and Title IX reporting, right? So they are the mechanism for reporting. That said, now that you've met me, if you feel comfortable coming to me and ever, want to sit down and have a private conversation with me, I am more than happy to do so, but then I'll be filing it with the EIC as a mandated reporter, right? So just find a person that you feel comfortable with and share it in one way, shape, or form. Let me pause there. The remaining time, I have a scenario that I'd like for us to kind of work through and think about how we might respond, think about whether there's something that needs responding to. But I wanted to pause and see if there are any questions before we go on. Karen, anything in the chat?
There's nothing in the chat at the moment.
I have a question. And maybe this, I don't know if this will come up in one of the case studies, but so a lot of times as faculty and students, we interface with the public, right? And you can have your research team out there in the field, and as agents of Drexel, as researchers, could be interfacing with patients or potential participants that are not part of Drexel,
Right.
that might exhibit some of this behavior.
Yeah.
And what's our recourse then when they're not part of the institution?
Right. I think that that's where practicing confrontation is especially important, right? Because it's our responsibility as faculty and staff, especially if we have student trainees right there who are experiencing that harm, for us to intervene, right? And I recognize that that's not something that all of us grew up learning how to do. But that's why I wanted us to have some time to think about it and encourage you to think about scenarios maybe that you've been in, and thought, God, I had no idea what to say. But know that the literature is on your side. People imagine the worst with confronting. And even in experiments where confrontation has been set up such that people experience, they are kind of induced to say something biased or to have a behavior interpreted as biased. They're confronted about it in a laboratory setting. And we see their reaction. The reactions are not as horrendous as we imagine that they will be, right? So it's really overcoming our own concerns about people's reactions that is probably the biggest challenge. We see similar kinds of data on, believe it or not, even with physical emergencies, people are often kind of like, oh, well, I don't know if it's my place to intervene and get involved. People think that it's going to be more embarrassing to do whatever than it actually is, or that there will be, more backlash than there actually is. So we tend to kind of overestimate that degree of backlash in our minds. But practicing, thinking about what could you say in that moment, I think is the way for us to kind of help be more prepared when that moment does occur. And it will occur, right? We've heard the stats now. We're going to be somewhere when someone either says something to us or says something to one of our students or one of our colleagues. And I like to think about, again, confrontation is a form of allyship. And we talk about creating a culture of belonging. And I also like to go one step further and think about creating a culture of care, which I think is incredibly relevant for the work that you all do here. And that culture of care, I have argued and others have argued, in other spaces, involves speaking out when a patient says something that's offensive. And it can be done, again, you don't have to be like, you racist SOB, you don't have to slap them. But to ask a question, can you explain what you meant by that? Do you think that that's appropriate to refer to the student in training like you just did? Getting people to reflect on their own bias in that moment can be a really compelling learning opportunity. I mean, think about times when you have felt kind of guilted, right? Mm-hmm. Why did a picture of my mom just pop into my mind, right? Like, just ultimate guilter. But, when you have been made to feel guilty about something, about letting someone down in some way, those are powerful learning moments. So that is what the confrontation literature is predicated on. It's predicated on the fact that most people, not all, but most people would feel bad if they thought that they had said or done something that hurt someone else in that space. And so when we raise that to their attention, it kickstarts that self-regulatory kind of process. Like, oh, is that the kind of person that I want to be? Maybe not. So huge literature. I'm happy to send you resources if you're interested. But let's, in the few minutes that we have left together, let's think about this particular scenario. And again, instead of trying to go through, the challenge of putting folks in the chat into breakout rooms and all that kind of stuff, what I thought we could do is just give you a minute or two to reflect on your own. And then, again, this is a safe zone for us all to learn, ask you to reflect out. So this, I will note, as I do most of the time when I am giving such workshops, this is based on an actual incident that happened at my previous institution. And so I know for a fact that it can happen, right? But imagine that you're attending a joint lab meeting with several faculty colleagues and graduate students. One of the first year students, who is an international student, is presenting their research idea in front of the lab for the first time. You are really impressed with their idea, and you're about to offer some constructive feedback about the measure that they're using, when one of your colleagues chimes in first. Wow, you're really articulate, especially for an international student. That was a good presentation. So my questions for you is whether you think there's anything problematic about this situation, and if so, how would you respond? So think about that for a few minutes on your own. Give you a chance to sort of reflect. And then if folks are willing to share, I'd really appreciate it. All right, thoughts about this situation? Either here or online. What do you think? Would you consider this a microaggression or some form of
I would agree.
Problematic? Yeah.
They're saying, especially for an international student, that implies that international students aren't expected to be articulate.
Mm-hmm.
And it sort of establishes for all the other graduate students and all the other international students that that is the expected language, that is okay. And it's not. As to how I would handle it, That I'm less sure of. I would probably try and talk to that colleague separately, not in a group setting. But at the same time, it should probably be addressed to the whole group at some point that it's a problem.
Okay.
Or
Maybe later?
Yeah.
So why would you want to talk to the, I think that's legit. There's no right or wrong answer here, right? So I think we can all learn from each other in terms of how we might respond. So why would you want to speak to the colleague separately?
No one likes being put on the spot in front of everybody. And it might have been a slip of the tongue, but it's something that they need to be aware of. You run the risk of escalating into an argument and having it become something much bigger if you do it just right then and there. And also you have time to organize your thoughts and figure out exactly what you want to say to this person. Is my thought.
And some of us, really need that. And so, that might be a more effective approach. If you need to gather your thoughts and think about it. Would it have made a difference if it had been like a really overt expression of bias? If it had been like a sexually harassing statement, let's say, would that change whether you would call a person out in the moment or want to speak with them privately? Because you said maybe it was a slip of the tongue. And that's the thing with microaggressions, like the intent is ambiguous, right? We don't know.
Yeah. If it was very obvious, I think it might warrant being called out directly then and there. But I feel like it gets to be a little situation dependent based on who all is there and what exactly is being said.
Absolutely.
And there's not really any clear, this is where it crosses a line. So you kind of just have to figure it out as it comes.
Yeah. Other thoughts?
There's a comment in the chat that echoes Zach's response, saying, to my colleague, I would ask, what did you mean by that?
And, again, I think a lot of times this is where I really am disappointed that as a field we landed on that term confrontation, because that doesn't sound like a confrontation, but it is, right? It is a form of confronting, to ask a question. And that has become like my go-to strategy oftentimes. Even in fairly cringeworthy kinds of situations where you're pretty sure you are figuring out what they mean by that. But again, to get that person to reflect on that themselves is much more powerful than me labeling it necessarily, right? Or can be. It's all context dependent, as you said, rightfully so. But I think that, when you are at a loss, like practicing a question, and that's an easy one, right? Could you explain what you meant by that?
Carol Ann followed up with a response as you were speaking, saying, we run the risk of the student learning that they can't count on being given in the moment support that they need.
Yeah. Yep. That's the challenge, right? So where I completely appreciate, needing a moment, not wanting to, humiliate a colleague or to have it kind of blow up. That is the other thing that we need to think about here as faculty and staff, that in this space, how does that student feel? How are we going to provide them with support? How do the other students feel? And I can tell you there's research on this too. Who do you think in a classroom setting, when something like that is said, people immediately look to? The faculty, right? They're just like, so what you going to do now? So thinking these things through in advance is helpful, but I get it. It's challenging. But I think we don't talk about it enough. And so hopefully this opens the door for more conversation. I understand this is part of a series. So, there could be opportunities to think through some other scenarios and kind of practice. But yeah, it's hard. Got a lot of different people in the room to consider taking care of. Anything else?
Do any of the folks online want to turn their camera on and chat? You're welcome to. We'll hear you.
I do, before people sign off, want to share. This is a link to a post-workshop survey. I'm always interested in your feedback for these and all of the workshops that I give. Try to have a Qualtrics. This is anonymous, so please share your thoughts about that. And then once people have had an opportunity, it's just a couple of questions, so it shouldn't take more than about 5 minutes to complete. I have a QR code to my office website as well. Happy to come back anytime. Happy to meet and discuss, share resources with you. Really appreciate the opportunity to visit with you today. Thanks, Roseanne, for the invite.
Thank you for having us. This was great.
Yeah.
Thank you all for joining us. We'll see you at the next session.